Hello and welcome to Chem Safety's What to Include in a Site Plan for Hazardous Substance Management webinar. My name is Alex Gray and I'll be presenting this topic by breaking it down into its constituents. The goal of this webinar is to assist with demystifying some of the legal requirements surrounding site plans and introduce viewers to widely available resources and tools for constructing their own site plan. This webinar is formatted into 5 main parts. We'll open with a general overview looking at segments of the regulations, and then responsibilities associated with site plan paperwork. In addition, we'll outline how to construct a site plan using free online satellite mapping tools and Microsoft Word. Then we'll look at applying these steps to some other brief examples such as larger sites, and we'll also look at some FENS recommendations for site maps. In the final section, we'll cover some non-essential components that people generally inquire about. The references implemented throughout this webinar are for the Health and Safety at Work Hazardous Substances Regulations 2017, which we'll refer to as the regulations throughout this presentation. Section 1. General Overview. The site plan is defined as a reference to a plan of a relevant place that is accurate and drawn to scale, to the extent necessary to enable the plan to meet its purpose and the provisions that refer to it, in particular by enabling a person inspecting the plan to identify actual distances and other relevant dimensions. Throughout the regulations, the requirements for a site plan are associated with either A. General requirements associated with hazardous substance locations, or HSLs, and/or depots, or B. Emergency response plans, or ERPs. The core concepts that are associated with a site plan are that they should be easily identifiable and accurate, with an emphasis on scale and dimensions, and be relevant to the workplace. Site plans become a mandatory requirement for businesses which store large quantities of hazardous substances on site. For example, in yellow here are some references to thresholds relating to different types of hazardous substances between classes 2 and 8. The references here are for different segments of the regulation, and in blue we've also got some areas where you have thresholds associated with emergency response plans. There are some other scenario-specific events that require a site plan, such as an outdoor pyrotechnic or fireworks display. These are slightly different to the ones that we'll be looking at for this webinar. Section 2. PCBU Responsibilities. The site plan is the PCBU's obligation, and if one is not in place, then it is their responsibility to have one constructed. This includes updates or changes that are made on site. In some instances, a hazardous substance location certifier might be able to create one for the PCBU for an additional fee. However, this is not standard practice and should not be assumed. Depending on the workplace, the site plan will be situated on one or more of the following. The entrance notice board. This tends to allow people and contractors moving on and off site to be aware of where hazards are located, filed with other hazardous substance location paperwork, or with the emergency response plan as part of a consolidated document. Section 3. Creating a basic site plan. The creation of a site plan is normally completed by a PCBU, as this is part of their mandatory paperwork. There are no special qualifications or requirements for this, as specified in the Health and Safety at Work Hazardous Substances Regulations. The interpretation section specifies that anyone can create it without needing any specialty background. The key points that are required to be on a site plan include the legal boundary, all of the buildings and structures on site, the scale, the address of the location, the name of the person who prepared the site plan, the date that it was prepared or created, all hazardous substance locations, and all physical positions of hazardous substances. There are also a few more technical parts highlighted down here in purple. For example, class 2, 3, and 4 substances, you'll have hazardous areas. For classes 1 and or 5 substances, there'll be control zones. There's also something called separation distances to public and protected places. And then finally, entry and exit points to the site. We'll begin with a very practical approach by creating a very small business site plan. And then in a later section, we'll look at how this translates into a larger business, or taking the same principles and applying them to a larger site. To begin, what you'll need is access to either some sort of mapping or satellite software, just to be able to get an outline of where the site is located. In this instance, you could use Google Maps, or if you search for a council website, you can normally find a council map which shows the legal property boundaries. For example, if we chose this random location, we can then highlight it to get the legal property boundary, as well as look at all the property structures which are on that site. From here, you can either screen print or you can use snippets to actually take a segment of this image and transfer it onto Microsoft Word. Following on from this, we can create a scale. If you're using Google Maps, you can right click and at the very bottom will be a measured distance tool. So you can actually measure the distances on site to create your scale. Likewise, if you're using one of the council map websites, there's a similar toolbar at the top left corner of the screen. You can use this to a similar effect. Once this is done, transfer this information into a scale for your sitemap on your Microsoft Word file. Now we'll look at adding your hazardous substance location and the identifier information. On your Microsoft Word file, if you include a table in the top left-hand corner, you can use this to populate the appropriate information. In this case, you want to specify what the document is, the address of the location, the name of the person who prepared the site plan, and also include the date that was prepared or created. Next, we want to indicate where the hazardous substances are located on the site. To do this, we'd recommend actually cropping out the section where they're located and then create a more zoomed in version to actually specify what's actually located there. In your Microsoft Word example, what you'll want to do is use the shapes, which will be in the toolbar at the top, to actually create the shape of this location, as well as some objects to clarify what's held in there. Next, we'll look at one of the more technical additions to the site plan. Before I would have mentioned it would either be a hazardous area or a control zone. In this example, we'll look at a hazardous area because we're looking at a flammable liquid store. So the hazardous areas associated with your substances will be located within some form of standard. As most of these require purchasing, we'd recommend either contacting a certifier or alternatively, the supplier of your hazardous substances can normally guide PCBUs of hazardous area dimensions. This would satisfy the following requirement: all hazardous areas. Next, we'll add the separation distance. This is that second technical part which would require a little more work. The separation distance associated with your substances will be located within the regulations. This can be quite technical, so we recommend contacting your certifier to get information on the separation distances. Now finally, we'll look at the entry and exit points for a site. You can add this in as little color-coded segments, which you overlay onto your image. From there, you'll want to create some sort of key to actually include this alongside all the other details that you've put in prior to this. This satisfies the following requirement of including entry and exit points for a site plan. So here we have a completed hazardous substance site plan. It has a few additional bits just to make it clear as to the direction of the site with a little north arrow. You'll notice in the top right hand corner we have some more information specifying the rest of the dimensions for the hazardous area. In addition, we also have the type of flammable liquid store which the hazardous substances are contained in. Section 4. Site Plan Comparison, Larger Sites and FENS Recommendations. For larger sites, you apply the same approach, except you'd spread it out across multiple pages. If you have an incredibly large site, you might want to also include some GPS coordinates. These can also be found using the same mapping tools that we used before. For example, on Google Maps, if you right-click and navigate down to "What's this?", it will give you a GPS coordinate for that particular location. Likewise, on council mapping sites, you'll also have a tool for navigating GPS coordinates. Here in the middle of the slide, you'll see a page example for an LPG site plan with multiple locations specified with GPS coordinates as well as titles. On the following pages, it'll then break down each of these locations with a zoomed in version, alongside a cropped section which will detail the hazardous area as well as separation distances associated with those LPG cylinders. Essentially, this incorporates all the same points that we looked at previously, just spread out across more pages with slightly more detail to actually document where these locations are. At the WorkSafe conference last year for site plans, there were some suggestions from FENS or Fire and Emergency New Zealand. By integrating some of the features from an emergency response plan into the site plan, it could assist with clarity with where the equipment is situated on site, as well as any other emergency locations for meeting and fire alarms. Section 5. Non-essentials. Are three-dimensional diagrams essential? No, in nearly every situation these don't add anything new to the site plan. The dimensions of hazardous areas can easily be recorded from a top-down perspective, and a note describing the elevation is more than acceptable. This concludes this webinar for Chem Safety. Thank you for coming, and if you have any further questions, please get in touch.